For millions of years in the late Carboniferous Earth's equatorial belt is covered in endless swampy rainforests, home to giant dragonflies, armoured amphibians, and towering club moss trees. Then the climate begins to shift. The air grows drier, the great coal swamps fragment, and one of the most dramatic rainforest collapses in Earth's history reshapes life on land. Tonight we explore how this turning point in deep time transformed ecosystems, triggered extinctions, and opened new paths for the animals that could survive a world no longer ruled by tropical swamps. If you enjoy calm journeys through Earth's past, please like, subscribe and share, and tell us in the comments what would you ask about living through the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse. Thank you for watching. Now let's begin. In the late Carboniferous world, Earth is dominated by the slow assembly of a vast landmass. The supercontinent Pangaea is in an advanced stage of coming together from earlier continental blocks such as Gondwana in the South Euramerica, nearer the equator, and smaller terrains that weld onto their margins, while broad tracts of ocean occupy the remaining surface. To the west and north stretches the Great Panthalassa Ocean, and to the east lies the Paleotethys Basin, so that Pangaea forms an immense irregular band of land bridging high southern and northern latitudes across the equatorial zone. This arrangement controls the pattern of winds and currents. Over the supercontinent, seasonal differences in heating between land and ocean generate large-scale pressure gradients. Warm moisture-laden air flows inland from surrounding seas, rises over the heated continental interior, and then returns at high levels of the atmosphere, establishing a monsoonal circulation that repeats year after year. Climate models and geological indicators of ancient wind patterns such as dune deposits and wind-blown silt on the continental interior point to strong seasonality in many parts of Pangaea. Yet near the equator, especially over low-lying areas of Euramerica, conditions remain broadly wet with regular rainfall, frequent cloud cover, and comparatively small swings in temperature across the year. This climatic background operates within the wider framework of the late Paleozoic Ice Age, a long interval during which large ice sheets rest on the southern continent of Gondwana. At high southern latitudes, thick ice masses advance and retreat across uplands and lowlands alike, carving valleys, leaving behind glacial deposits and releasing icebergs into nearby seas. Geologic records of striated pavements, drop stones in marine sediments, and stacked glacial and non-glacial units show that ice is a stable feature of the southern hemisphere during this time, even as its margins shift. Low latitudes are free of ice, but they are not isolated from its influence. As ice sheets grow, global sea level falls, exposing continental shelves and narrowing shallow seaways. When ice melts, sea level rises again, flooding basins and coastal plains. This cycle of glacio-eustatic change alters the shape of the continents along their edges and modifies the network of shallow epicontinental seas that lap against the margins of Pangaea. In many regions, including parts of Euramerica, repeated marine incursions and withdrawals leave layered successions of marine limestones, coastal sandstones, and non-marine mudstones that record the rhythm of sea level change. The composition of the atmosphere in this interval reflects the long history of land-plant evolution and carbon burial that marks the Paleozoic era. Since the Devonian vascular plants have spread across continental surfaces, developing deeper root systems and taller growth forms. By the late Carboniferous, large tree-sized plants are common in many low-latitude regions, and vast amounts of organic matter are produced each year. Where conditions are waterlogged and decomposition is slow, especially in peat-forming wetlands, this plant material accumulates and is eventually buried as coal. Over millions of years, the persistent burial of organic carbon contributes to relatively low concentrations of carbon dioxide in the air, compared with many earlier Paleozoic times. Proxy estimates based on soils, marine carbonates, and other geochemical indicators suggest that carbon dioxide concentration lies near the lower end of values, known for the Phanerozoic, consistent with a cool global climate and the presence of ice sheets on Gondwana. At the same time, the balance between photosynthesis, respiration, decay, and burial elevates atmospheric oxygen well above the level needed to sustain large active animals. Studies of charcoal abundance in coal and of experimental combustion in varying oxygen atmospheres indicate that the air contains enough oxygen to allow plant material to ignite and burn more easily than in many other geological intervals. Fire is therefore an integrated part of the late Carboniferous Earth system. In landscapes that are seasonally dry enough to permit fuels to cure lightning strikes, can trigger wildfires that run through vegetation. Layers rich in charcoal within coal seams and other sedimentary deposits show that such fires occur repeatedly. These fires consume some of the organic matter that would otherwise be buried, returning carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and modulating the rate at which carbon is locked away in sediments. In this way, fire participates in a feedback loop that links vegetation, atmospheric composition, and climate. However, in persistently wet low-latitude regions where groundwater lies near the surface and soils remain saturated for long periods, fire is less frequent and organic matter can build up as thick peat, reinforcing the drawdown of carbon dioxide and supporting continued high oxygen. Across the supercontinent, patterns of rainfall, temperature, and seasonality vary with latitude, topography, and distance from the sea. Coastal zones and lowland basins near the equator experience warm conditions with frequent precipitation and high humidity sustained by onshore winds and rising motion of moist air. Farther inland, especially on leeward sides of highlands and in interior basins, air that has lost much of its moisture descends and warms, creating drier environments. Wind-blown silt and sand accumulates in some of these interior regions, pointing to open, sparsely vegetated surfaces where the land is exposed to persistent winds. Along tectonically active belts, mountain building reshapes the landscape. Collisions between continental blocks drive the uplift of ranges whose presence affects rainfall patterns by forcing air to rise and cool on their windward flanks and descend drier on their lee sides. Sediments eroded from these highlands are transported by river systems that flow downslope towards subsiding basins and the nearby seas, where they are deposited in deltas, coastal plains, and shallow marine settings. Within this global framework, equatorial Euramerica occupies a key position. Its low-latitude proximity to warm seas and combination of tectonically created subsiding basins and adjacent uplands provide varied conditions for sediment accumulation and ecosystem development. River systems carry water and sediment from upland belts toward lowlands, where accommodation space is created by subsidence. In these low-lying regions, small changes in sea level and subsidence rates strongly influence whether a particular area lies under shallow marine water, sites within a coastal plain influenced by tides and river channels, or forms a near sea level wetland surface prone to waterlogging. Repeated cycles of transgression and regression act on timescales of hundreds of thousands to a few millions of years, while shorter-term climatic variations affect the frequency and intensity of rainfall, the discharge of rivers, and the balance between flooding and soil drying on seasonal and annual timescales. Through the interaction of plate motions, ice volume changes atmospheric circulation and the global carbon cycle. The late Carboniferous Earth settles into a state often described as an icehouse world With a cool mean climate, strong gradients between equator and poles, high atmospheric oxygen, relatively low carbon dioxide, and a planetary circulation pattern shaped by the large outline of Pangaea. Against this backdrop, low-latitude basins of Euramerica support extensive wetlands and dense vegetation, while elsewhere on the supercontinent drier interiors, uplands and high-latitude regions develop their own characteristic environments within the same overarching climatic and tectonic system. In the late Carboniferous, the equatorial cold belt of Euramerica occupies a band of low-latitude land that straddles the zone where the equator crosses the assembled and assembling parts of the continental mass. It extends through the low-lying regions of the Euramerican continent from areas adjacent to major mountain belts into interior basins that open toward shallow inland seas. Within this zone, bending of the crust in front of rising orogenic ranges creates long, gently subsiding foreland basins, while smaller intramontane depressions form where older crust is faulted and stretched. Sediments carried from uplifted belts to the north and south fill these spaces through time. Sand, silt, mud, and plant debris are supplied by river systems that flow off nearby highlands, cross low-relief plains, and ultimately reach coastal margins and shallow epicontinental seas. Many of these basins lie very close to sea level, so small changes in relative sea level or subsidence are enough to shift the boundary between marine coastal and terrestrial settings. In some intervals, shallow seas flood far inland, covering the lowlands with marine waters and leaving limestones, mudstones rich in marine fossils and tidal flat deposits. At other times, the sea retreats and broad coastal plains and lowlands occupy the same area crossed by river channels and covered by wetland vegetation. Stacked successions of marine and non-marine strata, often with coal seams developed in the terrestrial parts of each cycle, show how sensitive these basins are to repeated changes in water depth and sediment supply. The climate over the equatorial coal belt reflects its position near the equator on a large continent. Warm conditions prevail through the year, and winds blowing from surrounding seas transport moisture inland. Where moist air is forced to rise, it cools and condenses, producing frequent rainfall and sustaining high humidity. Many basins record conditions that approach ever wet or perhumid, meaning that rainfall and groundwater recharge maintain saturated soils for much of the year. In such settings, drainage is sluggish, standing water is common on the floodplains, and extensive peat-forming wetlands spread across low-lying surfaces. Plant material that falls into these waterlogged environments decays only slowly and over long intervals of continued wetness. Thick accumulations of peat build up. Elsewhere in the same belt, the balance between rainy and drier seasons shifts. Geological and botanical evidence indicates that some lowland basins alternate between intervals dominated by wetland vegetation and intervals when more seasonally dry floras occupy the landscape. Ancient soil horizons with features that indicate periodic drying the presence of plants, adapted to more open and seasonally stressed conditions, and changes in coal seam thickness and quality all point to a climate that oscillates between more humid and more seasonally dry phases on various timescales. This mosaic of ever-wet and seasonally wet regimes is superimposed on the longer rhythm imposed by the growth and decay of ice sheets on Gondwana. When ice volume increases, global sea level falls and the shoreline migrates basinward. Rivers in size or extend across newly exposed shelves, and lowland surfaces may be more prone to erosion. When ice volume decreases and sea level rises, the shoreline moves. Landward, new accommodation space is created and river systems adjust by depositing more sediment and building up coastal plains and deltas. In many equatorial basins, repeated alternations of marine and non-marine deposits, sometimes organized into sedimentary cycles, often referred to as cyclothems, preserve this pattern of glacial-eustatic control on water depth and landscape position. The equatorial cold belt is not a single continuous swamp but a patchwork of basins and sub-basins, each with its own subsidence history, distance from uplands and degree of connection to the sea. Some basins are large, long-lived structures where thick stacks of coal-bearing strata accumulate containing multiple coal seams, separated by sandstones, siltstones, and shales. Others are smaller or shorter, lived with thinner records and fewer opportunities for peat formation. Across this region, low topographic relief means that slight differences in elevation, sometimes only a few meters separate permanently waterlogged areas from slightly better drained surfaces, on the lowest ground where the water table remains close to or at the surface, peat mires and swamp forests persist for long periods, with only brief interruptions when flooding or marine incursions bring in sediment. On slightly higher ground, levees along river channels crevasse splays, where rivers spill onto floodplains and subtle interfluves support vegetation that experiences more frequent drying soil formation and disturbance by channel migration. Moving laterally from basin centres toward upland margins, the influence of local topography and orography increases. Uplifted belts to the north and south intercept moist air masses, enhancing rainfall on their windward sides and casting drier rain shadow zones on their leeward flanks. Sediment derived from these highlands is carried basinward by rivers, building alluvial fans, braid plains, and lower gradient channel belts that grade into the lowland wetlands. In some records from equatorial Pangaea, layers of windblown silt and very fine sand point to times and places where sparse vegetation and strong winds allow dust to be lifted and transported, even while nearby basins remain humid and support extensive wetlands. The combined effect of tectonic sea level change and atmospheric circulation is a band of low-latitude basins in which waterlogged lowlands favourable to peat accumulation are repeatedly established, modified and re-established through time. Within this dynamic but broadly humid framework, the equatorial coal belt of Euramerica consists of multiple, low-lying basins, in which tropical wetlands, forested mires, and associated river systems develop and persist across large areas of the late Carboniferous landscape, leaving behind thick coal-bearing successions that record the long-lived interaction of climate tectonics and water on this part of the supercontinent. In the equatorial lowlands of Euramerica, the coal forests form dense, persistent wetlands whose structure can be described from the floor of the swamp up through the highest crowns. The ground surface sits near the level of the water table, and in many places pools of standing water occupy shallow depressions between low rises built by roots and accumulated plant debris. Beneath this surface lies a thick layer of waterlogged peat, which is formed from partially decomposed plant remains that accumulate because microbial decay is slowed by low oxygen conditions in saturated sediments. The peat is not uniform. Its upper part contains recognizable fragments of root stems and leaves, while deeper layers become more compacted and altered. This soft saturated substrate is both a foundation and a record storing organic carbon and preserving details of past plant communities as they are buried. Anchored in this peat and in the underlying muddy soils is a network of rooting organs that radiate away from the bases of large plants. Many of the tallest plants in these forests belong to a group called lycopsids, which are vascular plants that in this time often grow as tall tree-sized forms rather than as small ground covers. Their underground parts spread laterally as broad axes that branch repeatedly and carry numerous fine appendages. Together, these structures form extensive mats that stabilize the peat and the underlying sediment. The shallow orientation of these rooting systems reflects the fact that the plants do not need to penetrate deeply to reach water. Instead, they extend horizontally to exploit the saturated zone just below the surface. Similar mats develop around the bases of other swamp plants as well, so that much of the uppermost sediment and peat is bound by an interlocking network of roots and root-like structures. Rising above this foundation are vertical stems and trunks that support the forest canopy. Tree-sized lycopsids show tall, relatively straight trunks, with a regular pattern of leaf scars preserved on their outer tissues. Near the base, the trunk diameter is large, narrowing upward toward a crown of branches and leaves that spreads out near the top. Alongside these plants grow other arborescent forms, including large horsetails and tree ferns, whose stems and fronds occupy the mid and upper levels of the forest. Seed ferns, which produce seeds rather than spores, but bear fronds that resemble those of true ferns, contribute additional structural diversity, some forming shrubby growth, and others developing taller forms where conditions allow. Between these large plants, a dense understory fills available light gaps. Smaller ferns, sphenopsids and herbaceous lycophytes occupy the shaded lower levels, sharing space with juvenile stages of the larger trees. In many stands, the combined effect of tall trunks, mid-level fronds and a continuous canopy near the top creates a strong vertical gradient in light and humidity. The upper canopy intercepts much of the incoming sunlight, so that light reaching the forest floor is filtered and subdued. High humidity persists within the forest interior because transpiration from leaves and limited air movement between the canopy and the ground slow the exchange of air with the atmosphere above. This vertical structure influences how water moves through the system. Rain falling onto the canopy is intercepted by leaves and branches, then drips or flows along stems to the ground, where it either infiltrates into the peat or runs off into shallow depressions and channels. Because the substrate is already waterlogged, much of the rain contributes directly to surface water and to the near-surface saturated zone. In low-lying areas, this leads to the persistence of shallow ponds and pools, while on slightly higher ground it maintains damp soils that rarely dry completely. The geometry of trunks and roots also affects overland flow by directing water around buttress-like bases and along subtle microtopographic gradients produced by growth and decay. Superimposed on these forested wetlands is a network of rivers that carry water and sediment through the lowlands. In many parts of the coal belt, rivers adopt styles that reflect the stabilizing effect of dense vegetation on their banks and floodplains. Instead of forming a single highly mobile channel, many rivers divide into multiple branches that weave around vegetated islands, a pattern sometimes described as anastomosing or anabranching. The presence of tree trunks, fallen wood, and root masses along the channels reduces bank erosion and helps maintain relatively stable pathways. Overbank flooding during high discharge spreads fine sediment and plant debris across the floodplain, which settles into the spaces between root hummocks and forest floor irregularities. Through time, this process builds up layers of mud and silt interbedded with organic rich horizons. Where river channels shift laterally or avulse to new positions, abandoned channels may become filled with organic rich muds and peat, which later are preserved as distinct features within the sedimentary record. The interaction between forest structure and fluvial processes creates a mosaic of habitats within the coal forests. Permanently waterlogged hollows host stands of plants that tolerate deep standing water, while slightly elevated ridges and levees along channels support communities that experience more frequent but shorter periods of flooding. In some areas, repeated flooding buries the lower trunks of tall plants in sediment, while their crowns continue to grow upward through the accumulating deposits, maintaining access to light and air. In other places, gradual peat accumulation raises the land surface relative to the water table, allowing a succession of plant communities to develop on the same site, as conditions move from open water to fen-like wetlands, and then to forested peat mires. Within this framework, different plant groups occupy characteristic positions in space and time. Giant lycopsid trees often dominate the wettest, most long-lived peat mires, forming stands with relatively low species diversity but high biomass. Tree ferns and other fern lineages become more prominent in some successions, where conditions favour slightly better drained or more disturbed habitats such as floodplains, more directly influenced by channel migration, or areas closer to upland sediment sources. Seed ferns and early conifer-like plants are more frequent on better drained sites, levees, and perhaps higher parts of the landscape, where fluctuating water tables and occasional droughts select for deeper rooting or more drought-tolerant strategies. Together, these patterns generate horizontal variation across the lowlands, with patches dominated by different combinations of plant groups depending on local water depth disturbance regime and time since the last major sedimentation event. The coal forests also regulate exchanges of carbon, nutrients and energy between the land surface and the wider Earth system. Through photosynthesis, the plants fix carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into organic matter, which is then partitioned among living tissues litter on the forest floor and the accumulating peat beneath. In the oxygen-poor conditions of the subsurface, peat microbial activity is limited, so only part of this organic matter returns rapidly to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The remainder is stored for long periods, especially where continued subsidence and sedimentation bury the peat beneath additional layers of mud and sand. In such cases, peat layers can eventually be transformed into coal over geological timescales. Nutrients taken up from groundwater and surface water cycle through leaf stems and roots, then return to the peat as plant tissues die and decay. Because water movement is often slow and export of dissolved nutrients is limited, many peat mires function as relatively closed systems in which nutrient availability depends strongly on the balance between plant uptake, internal recycling, and any inputs from flooding or groundwater inflow. Energy flows from the plant community to animal consumers through a variety of pathways. Herbivorous arthropods feed on leaf stems and spores, while decomposer communities including fungi and detritivorous invertebrates process dead plant material at the surface and in shallow subsurface layers where oxygen is still available. Higher-level consumers in turn feed on these primary and secondary consumers, building a food web whose base is sustained by the high productivity of the forest plants. In this way, the architecture of the coal forest, from rooting systems through trunks and canopy to the arrangement of wetlands and channels, determines both the physical habitat and the functioning of the ecosystem, and it establishes the conditions that allow thick peat accumulations to form, persist and eventually be buried as the coal seams that characterize the geological record of this time. Within the coal forests of equatorial Euramerica, the living community includes a dense and varied assemblage of animals that occupy the swamp floor, the water bodies, the tree trunks, and the air above the canopy. Arthropods are particularly abundant and diverse, and they form a major part of the visible fauna. Elevated atmospheric oxygen enhances the capacity of many arthropods to reach sizes that exceed those typical of later periods, and fossil remains from coal measures and associated deposits show that millipedes, insects and arachnids make use of the wide range of niches present in these wetlands. On the forest floor, large myriapods such as Arthropleura move through the litter and across the peat surface. Their elongated, segmented bodies and numerous limbs are suited to navigating the irregular soft substrate and their feeding habits are thought to include consumption of decaying plant material and possibly other organic matter. They share this ground layer with smaller millipede centipedes and various detritivorous arthropods that process fallen leaves, stems, spores, and other debris. Decomposition in these environments is limited by low oxygen within the saturated peat, but at the surface, where air can reach the litter, and shallow soil invertebrate detritivores and microbial communities work together to break down organic matter and recycle nutrients. Among the predators of the forest floor and lower trunks are scorpions, trigonotarbid, arachnids, and early spider-like forms that use claws and mouthparts to capture other arthropods and small vertebrates. They occupy crevices and bark spaces between roots and sheltered spots in the litter where humidity remains high and temperature fluctuations are moderate. Their presence indicates that the coal forest provides stable microclimates with sufficient prey to support numerous predatory lineages. Higher in the forest, insects exploit both foliage and airspace. Many lineages feed directly on plants or on their reproductive structures, cutting or piercing leaves, consuming spores, or boring into tissues. Others feed on decaying material or on the products of fungal activity. The air above the wetlands contains swarms of smaller flying insects, as well as large forms such as griffin flies, related to dragonflies, including species like Meganeura. Fossil wings from coal-bearing strata record wingspans that approach a metre, indicating that some of these aerial predators reach a substantial size. Morphological evidence and comparisons with modern analogues suggest that they patrol above ponds, channels, and open patches within the forest, capturing smaller insects in flight, and sometimes taking small vertebrate prey near the water surface. Because vertebrate flyers have not yet evolved, these large insects occupy the upper levels of the aerial predator guild with little competition from other animal groups. Many insects with aquatic larvae, such as mayflies and related forms, depend on the abundance of standing and flowing water within the coal forests. Eggs are laid into ponds, floodplain lakes, and quiet reaches of rivers where larvae develop in the water column, or among submerged vegetation and organic debris. They feed on algae, fine detritus, or small invertebrates, and eventually emerge into the air as adults, providing a mobile link between aquatic and terrestrial compartments of the ecosystem. Their mass emergences deliver pulses of biomass that can be exploited by predators in both realms. In the water bodies that occupy abandoned channels, small lakes, and deeper swamp pools, additional invertebrate and vertebrate communities develop. Crustaceans, aquatic insects, worms, and other invertebrates inhabit the sediments and water column, feeding on suspended particles, algae, or other animals. Freshwater and brackish fishes, which may include early forms of actinopterygians and other Paleozoic lineages, prey on these invertebrates and on each other. Their remains, along with coprolites rich in bone fragments, are preserved in fine-grained sediments that settle from still or slow-moving water, providing a record of trophic interactions within these aquatic settings. The transition zones between open water and forested wetlands, such as muddy margins, shallow shelves, and flooded forest floors, host additional assemblages that exploit fluctuating water levels and periodic flooding. Vertebrate tetrapods occupy key positions in this web of life, although their detailed history is addressed elsewhere. In the context of the coal forests as functioning ecosystems, amphibian and early amniote tetrapods use the wetlands as feeding and breeding grounds. Amphibians often retain strong ties to permanent or seasonal water bodies for reproduction, laying eggs in ponds and streams, and their larvae grow in aquatic habitats before transforming into more terrestrial adults. Early amniotes, which possess eggs and skin better suited to reducing water loss, are less tightly constrained by open water. but still forage within the forested lowlands, hunting insects and other small animals among roots, fallen logs, and leaf litter. Trackways preserved on ancient floodplain surfaces, and occasional body fossils preserved within hollow tree trunks or channel fills show that these vertebrates move extensively through the coal forest landscapes, sharing space with invertebrates and fishes in the same basins. The tree trunks and peat surfaces themselves provide additional niches, bark surfaces and the interfaces between living tissues and peat host small arthropods, including mites, collembolans, and delicate insects that feed on microbial films, spores and fine organic particles. Some insects bore into plant tissues or exploit dead wood, while others dwell on the surfaces of fronds and stems, feeding on plant fluids or scraping tissues. These fine-scale interactions are only partly recorded in the fossil record through trace fossils, such as feeding damage on leaves and stems coprolites, and small body fossils preserved in fine-grained sediments or within coal layers. Despite the incompleteness of these records, they indicate that the coal forests support complex trophic networks that link primary producers, decomposers, herbivores, and multiple levels of predators. The structure of this web is influenced by the physical template of the swamp environment. The distribution of permanently waterlogged hollows, better drained levees, and forested peat surfaces determines where different combinations of plants and animals can persist. In the wettest hollows, detritivorous and filter-feeding organisms exploit the steady input of plant debris from the surrounding forest, while the margins of channels and lakes provide ambush and foraging sites for predators that can move between water and land. On slightly elevated ground where soils may firm up between floods, burrowing animals ground, dwelling insects and small tetrapods can occupy more permanent burrow systems or surface pathways. Above them, the canopy and mid-levels of the forest support mobile insect faunas that transfer energy and matter across horizontal distances and between vertical zones. Across the equatorial coal belt, similar associations of plants, arthropods, fishes and tetrapods are repeated in basin after basin, producing a broadly cosmopolitan pattern of swamp communities within the low-latitude regions that host these forests. Together, these organisms form an integrated life web in which the high productivity of the coal forest plants the persistent presence of standing and flowing water and the physical complexity of the swamp terrain create the conditions for a rich and varied fauna that occupies nearly every available niche in and around the Carboniferous wetlands. Within the equatorial coal forests, the movement of carbon, oxygen and other elements is governed by a balance between high biological productivity at the surface and restricted decomposition in the waterlogged subsurface, and this balance links the lowland wetlands tightly to the wider late Carboniferous Earth system. Tree-sized lycopsids, horsetails, ferns, seed ferns, and their understory companions fix substantial amounts of carbon through photosynthesis building, trunks, fronds, roots, and spores. Each year a fraction of this organic matter enters the litter layer as leaves fall, stems die, and roots are replaced. On the forest floor, some of this material is consumed quickly by detritivorous arthropods and microbial communities in the thin aerated zone at the interface between air and substrate. However, much of it is incorporated into the peat that accumulates beneath the living vegetation. In these waterlogged layers, oxygen is rapidly depleted and microbial processes slow, so that plant tissues are only partially broken down before new material is added above. Over thousands to millions of years, continued plant production and repeated burial of organic matter in subsiding basins lead to the buildup of thick peat bodies that can reach many meters in thickness when measured from their base to the surface that carries the living forest. Where these peat bodies are later buried under additional sediment and compacted, they are transformed into coal, retaining a densely packed record of the vegetation and environmental conditions under which they formed. The degree to which organic matter is preserved rather than oxidized back to carbon dioxide depends on local hydrology temperature and the supply of oxygenated water. In the saturated interiors of long-lived mires, groundwater moves slowly and dissolved. Oxygen is consumed near the surface, creating strongly reducing conditions at depth. Under such conditions, microbial communities rely more on alternative electron acceptors than free oxygen, and the rate at which carbon is returned to the atmosphere is much lower than the rate at which it is fixed by the forest. In more seasonally influenced wetlands where water levels fluctuate and oxygen can penetrate deeper into the substrate during drier intervals, decomposition is more efficient and less peat is preserved. Thus, even within a single basin, the net sequestration of carbon varies between different parts of the landscape, with the thickest, most laterally extensive peat deposits forming where the water table remains close to the surface and subsidence keeps pace with accumulation. The cumulative effect of these processes across many basins and over long intervals is a sustained transfer of carbon from the atmosphere into buried organic matter. Reconstructions of the long-term carbon cycle indicate that during the late Carboniferous and early Permian burial of organic carbon in coal and other sedimentary deposits is unusually intense compared with many other times in the Phanerozoic record. This drawdown of carbon dioxide is one of the factors associated with the cool global climate of the late Paleozoic Ice Age, during which large ice sheets persist on Gondwana. At the same time, the net effect of enhanced organic carbon burial, when balanced against volcanic degassing and weathering of rocks, is an increase in atmospheric oxygen relative to earlier Paleozoic intervals, producing a distinctive combination of low carbon dioxide and elevated oxygen that persists for several tens of millions of years. In the coal forests themselves, this atmospheric composition influences both life and physical processes. Elevated oxygen supports the large body sizes seen in many arthropods and increases the likelihood that dry plant material ignites and sustains combustion when exposed to heat. Yet the coal belt as a whole is not uniformly flammable. In the ever-wet cores of extensive mires, fuels remain saturated, and the likelihood of sustained surface fires is low. It is in areas where seasonal drying affects the upper layers of peat and litter, such as on levees higher interfluves or basin margins, with stronger dry seasons that fire becomes more common. In such settings, periods without rain allow fine fuels and upper peat layers to lose moisture. Lightning strikes or more rarely volcanic activity provide ignition sources, and fires can propagate through surface litter undergrowth and the upper peat. The products of these fires include charcoal, which is resistant to decay and can be incorporated into peat and later coal as a component known as inertinite. High inertinite contents in many late Carboniferous coals show that wildfires are a recurring feature of these landscapes, and that combustion plays an important role in the cycling of carbon. Where fires occur, part of the carbon fixed by plants is rapidly returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, while the rest is locked into charcoal fragments that may be buried and preserved alongside unburned plant remains. Fire also alters local vegetation structure by removing above-ground biomass opening patches in the canopy and changing the microenvironment at the ground surface, effects that influence subsequent patterns of plant regeneration and succession. On basin to regional scales, the interplay between fire peat accumulation and sedimentation adds further complexity to the record of carbon storage. In some intervals, prolonged wet conditions and high water tables favour continuous peat growth, with minimal burning producing thick coal seams rich in relatively unaltered organic matter. In others, repeated episodes of drying and fire lead to more fragmented peat bodies with greater proportions of inertinate and more abundant partings of mineral sediment introduced during post-fire floods. These variations encode shifts in climate and hydrology, as well as in the frequency and intensity of wildfires, even though the overall character of the equatorial lowlands remains that of a humid belt with extensive wetlands. The gases released by decomposition and combustion in and around the coal forests are not limited to carbon dioxide. Wetlands that are perennially waterlogged and rich in organic matter are likely sources of methane generated by microbial communities in strictly anoxic microenvironments, where other electron acceptors have been exhausted. Methane that diffuses to the surface enters the atmosphere where it participates in short-term greenhouse warming before being removed by photochemical reactions. Although the precise magnitude of methane emissions from these ancient wetlands is uncertain, the coexistence of cool global conditions with extensive peatlands suggests that the long-term cooling effect of carbon sequestration and low carbon dioxide dominates over any warming influence from methane on multi-million-year timescales. Nutrient cycling in the coal forests is also strongly shaped by the hydrological and redox regime. In closed or nearly closed mires, nutrients taken up by plants are largely recycled within the system as litter falls and decomposes near the surface, with only minor export in dissolved form. Where rivers periodically flood the peatlands, additional nutrients and mineral particles are supplied from upstream, helping sustain productivity. In turn, the organic rich waters that leave the wetlands carry dissolved and particulate material into downstream lakes, estuaries, and shallow seas, where they influence productivity and sedimentation patterns. In this way, the equatorial coal forests serve both as sinks and sources of carbon and nutrients, depending on the temporal and spatial scale considered. When viewed over the entire late Carboniferous, however, the net burial of organic carbon in these coal-forming systems contributes to a global environment characterized by low atmospheric carbon dioxide, relatively high oxygen, and persistent ice sheets on the southern continent, while at the scale of individual basins, the forest's peat meres, rivers, and fire regimes form a tightly coupled set of processes that maintain the distinctive character of the coal belt landscapes. In the low-latitude coal belt, the climatic background that has supported extensive wetlands and peat-forming forests does not remain entirely fixed. Over intervals that span many hundreds of thousands to several millions of years, signals begin to appear in the sedimentary and fossil record that indicate shifts in temperature, rainfall, and seasonality across the late Carboniferous world. At high southern latitudes on Gondwana, ice sheets wax and wane as part of the late Paleozoic Ice Age. Each major advance locks additional water into land-based ice, lowers global sea level, and expands the area covered by glacial deposits, while each retreat releases meltwater back to the oceans and raises sea level again. Evidence from stacked glacial and non-glacial strata shows that these changes do not occur as a single smooth trend, but rather as a series of distinct glacial episodes separated by less icy intervals. As the late Moscovian Age approaches its end, some records point to an intensification of these glacial cycles. The range between high stand and low stand sea levels increases, and the frequency of large-scale shifts in shoreline position grows. In basins along the equatorial belt, this behavior is recorded as more pronounced alternations between marine and non-marine units, with thicker packages of coastal and terrestrial sediments laid down between individual marine incursions and more deeply incised river valleys that cut into older deposits when sea level falls. Such features imply that the vertical movement of sea level relative to the land driven by changing ice volume begins to exert a stronger control on the landscapes in which the coal forests sit. At the same time, indicators from ancient soils and plant communities within the tropical belt suggest that the atmospheric circulation patterns delivering moisture to these regions begin to change. In earlier parts of the Pennsylvanian, many lowland paleosols are strongly hydromorphic, with features that show sustained saturation, limited development of soil structure, and frequent waterlogging. Through time, however, a greater proportion of soil profiles display signs of more regular drying. Blocky structures, accumulations of certain minerals that form under better drained conditions, and evidence for repeated wetting and drying cycles appear in the rock record of some basins. These changes point to climates in which rainfall is still abundant on an annual basis, but becomes more seasonal with longer intervals during which the ground surface and near-surface layers can lose water to evaporation and plant transpiration before the next episode of sustained precipitation. In the context of the coal forests, such a shift in seasonality would be expected to alter the balance between permanently waterlogged mires and more intermittently saturated floodplains, even if total annual rainfall remains high. The distribution of ever-wet conditions becomes more patchy, confined to the most subsiding parts of basins, and to settings where groundwater can be maintained near the surface, while surrounding areas experience stronger contrasts between wet and dry parts of the year. Additional evidence for climatic change comes from the composition and arrangement of plant assemblages preserved in coal-bearing successions. In some regions, assemblages dominated by the giant lycopsid trees, characteristic of earlier coal swamps, give way in a stepwise pattern to communities in which opportunistic ferns and other spore-bearing plants occupy a larger share of the record. These shifts occur at multiple horizons and are repeated in different basins, suggesting that they are not purely local accidents of preservation, but reflect broader changes in the environments available to different plant groups. The pattern seen in many successions is one in which distinct plant assemblages follow one another without extensive mixing, implying that climatic and hydrological thresholds are crossed, rather than that ecosystems change gradually through an extended continuum of intermediate states. At the scale of river systems, changes in climate and vegetation combine to modify channel patterns and floodplain dynamics. In earlier intervals, many rivers within the coal belt display anastomosing styles with multiple relatively stable channels separated by vegetated islands and floodplain surfaces bound by dense root networks. As climatic seasonality increases and some areas experience longer periods of lower discharge between floods, channels in certain basins become more prone to incision and lateral migration, and more single-threaded or braided patterns appear. Greater variability in discharge through the year associated with more distinct wet and dry seasons enhances the potential for episodic erosion during high flows and for exposure and soil formation during low flows. Logs and other woody debris still play a role in shaping channel form, but in some sections their abundance decreases relative to earlier times, in line with evidence for changes in the structure and continuity of floodplain forests. At a broader scale, reconstructions of atmospheric composition and ice volume indicate that the long-term trend toward lower carbon dioxide and strong glaciation persists, but superimposed on this trend are shorter intervals of particularly intense cooling and ice growth. During these cooler phases, equatorial regions may experience stronger pressure gradients between ocean and land-altered monsoon dynamics and changes in the position and strength of tropical convergence zones. The combined effect of these atmospheric and cryospheric shifts is a gradual reorganization of climatic regimes within the tropics. Regions that previously lie within an almost continuously humid belt begin to experience stronger seasonal contrasts, and the spatial pattern of rainfall becomes more heterogeneous. Some basins continue to receive enough moisture to sustain extensive peat-forming wetlands, while others enter regimes in which extended dry intervals, more variable river flow, and more frequent exposure of soil surfaces become normal features of the climate system. Within this evolving framework, the equatorial coal belt still supports vast wetlands and forests in many areas, but the first clear signs appear in the geological record that the climate underpinning these ecosystems is moving toward a more seasonally structured and in some places drier and cooler state than that which characterized earlier phases of the late Carboniferous, as climatic shifts and stronger glacial cycles begin to affect the equatorial belt. The once extensive coal forests of Euramerica no longer form a nearly continuous band of wetland vegetation across low-latitude basins. Instead, the distribution of swamp forests and peat-forming mires becomes more irregular in space and more variable in time, and the geological record starts to show that habitats are splitting into separated patches rather than covering broad, uninterrupted tracts of land. In subsiding basin centres where accommodation space continues to develop and groundwater can remain close to the surface, peat accumulation and a dense wetland forest still persist. Thick successions of coal and associated organic rich mudstones demonstrate that in these settings, waterlogged conditions and high plant productivity continue to favour long-lived mires. However, as sea level fluctuations become more pronounced and seasonality in rainfall increases, the stability of wetlands on more elevated surfaces declines. Structural highs within basins levees along major river channels, and gently raised interfluves that once supported swamp forests for extended intervals begin to experience more frequent and longer periods of drying. Paleosols on these surfaces show better developed structures, more evidence of repeated wetting and drying, and accumulations of minerals that indicate improved drainage compared with earlier, more perennially saturated stages. In such places, thick, laterally continuous peat blankets are no longer sustainable over long timescales. Instead, peat accumulation becomes thinner, more discontinuous and more sensitive to short-term changes in water table position. The pattern that emerges is one in which peat-forming wetlands are increasingly confined to zones where subsidence groundwater supply and local topography combine to maintain saturation, often in narrow belts, along subsiding troughs, valley floors, and fault-controlled lows, while surrounding areas shift toward more seasonally flooded or even periodically dry conditions. Within individual basins, this reorganization produces a mosaic of habitat patches that vary in size, shape, and degree of isolation. Areas of forested mire that were once connected along the strike of a basin may become separated by stretches of floodplain that remain vegetated but no longer support sustained peat growth, or by surfaces that develop more open, seasonally stressed plant communities. In the sedimentary record, this change is reflected by coal seams that thin laterally and pinch out over short distances by coal bodies that are restricted to particular stratigraphic levels and localities rather than being present across an entire basin, and by an increase in the thickness and frequency of clastic packages between individual coal units. These clastic intervals often contain soil horizons, channel sandstones and overbank mudstones that together indicate more active fluvial reworking and longer episodes between the establishment of new mires. The fragmentation is not uniform across the equatorial belt. Some basins, because of their subsidence history, proximity to moisture sources and internal topography, remain favourable sites for coal forest persistence longer than others. In these refugial basins, thick coal sequences with abundant plant fossils continue to record swamp ecosystems that resemble those of earlier late Carboniferous times, even as neighbouring basins start to show a stronger imprint of drying and increased seasonality. Other basins lose extensive mires earlier, and their late Moscovian and early Casimovian strata are dominated by non-peat-forming floodplain and channel deposits with only thin or rare coal seams. At the scale of the entire Euramerican tropics, the cumulative effect is that the coal forest biome becomes dissected into multiple separated regions of humid wetland vegetation, separated by expanses of terrain where the climate no longer allows continuously saturated lowlands to occupy wide areas. This physical segmentation of habitats has consequences for the way plant assemblages are distributed. In earlier intervals, similar coal swamp floras occur across large parts of the equatorial belt, and many plant taxa display broad geographic ranges within the humid zone. With the onset of stronger climatic gradients and increased fragmentation of wetland environments, opportunities for exchange of propagules between different basins diminish. Populations of swamp plants become confined to those basins, and subbasins where suitable habitat persists, and the distances between such favourable areas increase as regions of more seasonal or drier climates expand between them. The fossil record suggests that floral assemblages within individual basins remain internally consistent for significant periods, while adjacent basins with different hydrological and climatic conditions host distinct combinations of plant taxa. There is little evidence for widespread mixing of these assemblages across broad areas once the fragmentation is underway. Instead, one assemblage tends to give way to another in a relatively abrupt manner when local conditions cross threshold that no longer support the existing community. In fluvial systems, the shift from an extensive, densely forested floodplain to more compartmentalized habitats is expressed by changes in river architecture. Anastomosing river patterns that rely on stable vegetated islands and floodplains become less common in some upper Pennsylvanian successions, particularly near the Moscovian-Casimovian boundary. In their place, more laterally mobile or more strongly single-threaded channels appear with fewer preserved accumulations of large woody debris and a reduction in indicators of persistent continuous forest cover along the banks. This does not mean that forest disappears from floodplains, but rather that its spatial continuity is reduced and the capacity of vegetation to stabilize an entire valley floor diminishes as areas of more open or seasonally stressed vegetation expand. Even within refugial basins, evidence exists for internal fragmentation. Mires that once extended over many kilometers become segmented into smaller units, bounded by channel belts, crevasse splays, or slightly higher ground that experiences stronger seasonal drying. The result is a patchwork of wetland blocks separated by corridors of different vegetation or more disturbed ground, which can act as partial barriers to the spread of peatland plant communities. From the perspective of animals that depend on swamp forests and waterlogged habitats, this same physical reorganization translates into a landscape in which continuous tracts of suitable environment shrink and break apart. Amphibians tied to permanent or long-lasting water bodies, and invertebrates whose life cycles require stable, humid forest interiors now inhabit basins that function as separate patches rather than parts of a single, nearly continuous corridor across the equatorial belt. The distances between these patches measured in terms of habitat availability rather than simple geographic separation increase as more terrain falls under climates that no longer support coal forests. As a result, dispersal between basins becomes more difficult. Local extinctions become more likely when conditions deteriorate within a basin, and the potential for populations to follow shifting climatic zones by migrating across the landscape is reduced. Despite this, the process is not instantaneous. For a time, coal-forming tropical wetlands continue to occupy many equatorial basins, and new mires can still develop in favourable lowlands as subsident sedimentation and hydrology allow. The key difference is that their overall extent and connectivity across Euramerica diminish. The late Moscovian to early Casimovian interval thus marks a transition from a world in which vast interconnected wetlands dominate much of the equatorial belt to one in which those wetlands persist mainly as separated refugees embedded within a broader framework of more seasonal and spatially heterogeneous climates, setting the stage for the ecological and evolutionary responses that follow. In the equatorial coal belts of the late Moscovian giant lycopsid trees still occupy a central ecological role in many peat-forming wetlands, yet the same climatic and hydrological shifts that fragment the coal forests across basins also begin to undermine the conditions that allow these plants to dominate. Arborescent lycopsids such as lepidodendron and related forms are specialized wetland trees. They anchor themselves in waterlogged substrates, with shallow, laterally extensive rooting systems composed of stigmarian axes and attached rootlets that spread through the uppermost peat. Their trunks grow rapidly, producing tall, relatively unbranched stems that terminate in crowns of leaves and reproductive structures, and their life history appears to favor fast exploitation of saturated low-nutrient mires, where competition for light is intense, but water supply is reliable. Spores produced in large quantities are dispersed into the humid air and onto wet substrates where they germinate and complete a life cycle tightly linked to consistently moist conditions, as long as water tables remain close to the surface over large contiguous areas. This strategy supports dense stands of lycopsid trees and allows them to form the structural backbone of many coal swamps. When climate becomes more seasonal and water tables fluctuate more strongly, the same traits that confer success under perennially saturated conditions become liabilities. Shallow rooting systems are sensitive to even modest drops in the water table, as the peat layers that once remained saturated throughout the year begin to experience drying from the top down during extended dry intervals. In such circumstances, the upper parts of the peat can compact, crack, and oxidize, and the mechanical stability provided by waterlogged cohesive substrates decreases. Trees that rely on shallow lateral roots anchored in soft saturated peat become more vulnerable to mechanical stress during storms and to desiccation in roots and lower stems. At the same time, germination and establishment of lycopsid spores require sufficiently moist surfaces. Repeated or prolonged drying of the substrate between rainy seasons limits the windows during which new individuals can successfully take root. Geological and paleobotanical evidence shows that as these hydrological changes intensify, the composition of plant assemblages in many equatorial basins begins to shift in a stepwise manner. In numerous late Moscovian successions, floras dominated by lycopsid trees are followed by intervals in which opportunistic ferns and other spore-bearing plants become much more frequent in the macrofossil record and in dispersed spore assemblages. These ferns are often better able to colonize disturbed or more transiently wet substrates, including floodplain surfaces, that experience intermittent saturation rather than permanent waterlogging. Their increase suggests that parts of the landscape are moving away from conditions that favor long-lived stable mires and toward regimes characterized by more frequent disturbance and stronger seasonality in soil moisture. In earliest Casimovian strata in many tropical Euramerican basins, this trend culminates in an abrupt decline and local extinction of several major lycopsid lineages that once formed the framework of the swamp forests. Analyses of plant macrofossils and palynological records show that assemblages dominated by Lycospora producing lepidodendrids and similar taxa give way over short stratigraphic intervals to assemblages in which Maratialian tree ferns and other fern groups become the primary arborescent components of wetland communities. This change is not expressed as a gradual blend of old and new elements, but rather as a sequence of distinct floras that replace one another with little mixing. In many studied sections, the lycopsid-dominated assemblage is followed by a fern-rich assemblage in which lycopsids are rare or absent, and then by further assemblages with different combinations of seed ferns and tree ferns. The discrete nature of these transitions indicates that climatic and hydrological thresholds are crossed. Once conditions pass beyond the range tolerated by the giant lycopsid trees, they do not persist as major components within the new climatic regime. The spatial pattern of lycopsid decline mirrors the fragmentation of wetland habitats described earlier. In parts of Euramerica where basins retain strongly humid, perennially wet conditions and continued subsidence, lycopsid trees survive longer, and some genera endure into intervals when they have already disappeared from more seasonally stressed basins. For example, in certain regions there is evidence that Sigillaria and other lepidodendrid genera persist as significant elements of the flora after their close relatives have been extirpated from other parts of the tropical belt. Spore assemblages from seasonally dry lowlands also show that even where macrofossils of lycopsids become rare or vanish from outcrops, spores attributable to these plants can still be detected, suggesting that small, spatially restricted populations persist in local refugia, perhaps in wet valley floors or in basins where groundwater remains high, even under more seasonal climates. These refugial populations, however, no longer define the primary structure of widespread coal forest ecosystems. Instead, they become subordinate elements in a landscape increasingly controlled by other plant groups. As giant lycopsid trees retract, tree ferns rise to prominence in many wetland settings. Moratylian tree ferns have different growth forms and rooting strategies from lepidodendrids. Their stems and fronds create dense canopies in wetlands that may experience more variable water tables, and their root systems can function under conditions that include periodic lowering of the water table as long as adequate moisture is available during key growth phases. Alongside them, seed ferns and early conifer-like plants increase in abundance, particularly on sites with better drainage such as levees, higher floodplain surfaces and basin margins. These seed plants, with their reproductive structures adapted to dispersal that does not require free water for fertilization, and with tissues more tolerant of water stress, expand into environments that are becoming less favorable for lycopsid reproduction and survival. In seasonally dry floras on the fringes of former coal forest regions, seed plants often dominate, while wetland patches retain a mixture of ferns and more moisture-demanding components. The combined effect of these changes is a reorganization of vertical and horizontal structure within lowland plant communities. Forests that were once characterized by tall, relatively uniform lycopsid trunks with crowns concentrated near the top become rarer. In their place, wetlands host more structurally varied stands of tree ferns, seed ferns and other spore plants, often with a greater mixture of growth forms and canopy architectures. On floodplains and basin margins, woodier seed plants add an additional structural dimension occupying ground that once lay within the influence of extensive swamps, but that now undergoes more regular drying. The resulting vegetation patterns differ not only in taxonomic composition, but also in their interaction with geomorphic processes, hydrology, and fire regimes. Reduction in the density of lycopsid-dominated mires diminishes the extent of the most stable peat-accumulating surfaces, while the expansion of more seasonally structured vegetation regimes promotes fluvial styles and soil properties that record higher variability in discharge and moisture through the year. From the standpoint of the late Carboniferous Earth system, the decline of giant lycopsid forests marks a transition in how tropical lowland vegetation interacts with climate and sedimentary basins. The strong coupling between permanently waterlogged mires, thick peat accumulation, and lycopsid-dominated canopies that characterizes earlier Pennsylvanian times gives way to a more heterogeneous arrangement, in which peat deposition is more spatially restricted. Wetland communities are less dominated by a single plant group, and seed plants and tree ferns play a larger role in structuring both wetlands and adjacent seasonally dry lowlands. Lycopsids persist for some time as components of these reorganized ecosystems and in scattered refugia, but they no longer control the architecture and functioning of tropical lowland forests across most of Euramerica. Once the main phase of climatic and hydrological change associated with the late Moscovian to earliest Casimovian interval has passed. As the late Moscovian gives way to earliest Casimovian time, the fragmentation of the equatorial coal forests produces a landscape in which wetland vegetation persists, mainly in scattered refugia, while new floras spread across the intervening terrain. In many basins, the most persistent refuges for swamp plants occupy structurally controlled lows, such as subsiding troughs, paleo valleys in size during earlier sea level falls, and narrow belts along long-lived river systems where groundwater remains high even as regional climates become more seasonal. In these settings, the combination of subsident sediment supply and local topography allows water tables to stay close to the surface for much of the year, and peat formation continues in mires that now occupy smaller and more topographically constrained areas than the earlier basin-wide wetlands. Coal seams associated with these refugia tend to be laterally restricted and locally thick, and they are often overlain and underlain by mudstones and sandstones that record more strongly seasonal floodplain conditions nearby. Within the refugial wetlands, plant assemblages differ from the giant lycopsid-dominated communities that once formed the framework of the coal forests. In many cases, Moratylian tree ferns make up a large fraction of the arborescent component, producing canopies above, understories of smaller ferns, sphenopsids and herbs. Seed ferns and other pteridosperms remain present as important structural and reproductive elements, and in some refugi hydrophilic lycopsids and sphenopsids survive as subordinate constituents occupying the wettest microsites such as pond margins, pools in paleo valleys or the cores of small peat domes. Spore assemblages from coals and shales above coals show that these wetland refugia maintain a conservative set of taxa over intervals of at least hundreds of thousands of years, even as the areal extent of wetlands fluctuates with glacial interglacial cycles and regional climate. The composition of these assemblages indicates that many lineages remain ecological specialists tied to ever wet or strongly waterlogged substrates, and that their persistence depends on the continuity of such habitats within a given basin. Surrounding the refugial mires, new floras occupy floodplains, levees, basin margins and upland slopes, where seasonality in rainfall and soil moisture is more pronounced. These floras draw from a different species pool dominated by seed plants and chordates, with rooting systems, leaf traits and reproductive strategies better suited to mineral soils that undergo repeated drying and rewetting. In many sections, macrofloras and associated paleosols from these settings show a consistent association between more deeply developed soil profiles, features indicating better drainage and assemblages rich in seed, ferns, chordates, and early conifer-like plants with Moratylian tree ferns present, but often as part of a mixed canopy rather than as the overwhelming dominant. These plant communities form open to closed woodlands, shrublands, and seasonally wet forests rather than peat-forming swamps, and they record a biome that occupies lowlands during drier or more strongly seasonal intervals when wetland specialists are confined to valley floors and other topographic lows. over time the spatial pattern that emerges in many equatorial basins is one of sharp ecological juxtaposition between wetland refugia and adjacent seasonally dry or intermittently wet floras. The boundaries between these communities follow subtle but persistent gradients in elevation, substrate, and water table position. Within a single valley system, a narrow belt of peatland and tree fern dominated wet forest. In the deepest part of the valley may grade laterally over a short distance into a belt of mineral soil woodland on slightly higher terraces, and then into more open vegetation on even higher interfluves and basin margins. In the stratigraphic record, this arrangement is reflected by closely interbedded coal-rooted mudstone and channel sandstone units, each containing plant assemblages that belong to distinct ecological groups, rather than to a single continuously varying flora. Paleobotanical analyses show that these wetland and dryland floras are compositionally discrete and conservative. Within each ecological domain, particular combinations of taxa recur repeatedly, through multiple sedimentary cycles with little mixing between the species pools. Wetland assemblages dominated by tree ferns and associated mire taxa reappear after periods of climatic or sea level fluctuation, when peat-forming conditions return, while dryland assemblages dominated by seed plants reoccupy basin margins and better drained surfaces when conditions revert to more seasonal regimes. Changes in dominance or the replacement of one major community type by another tend to occur over short stratigraphic intervals, and to involve abrupt shifts from one stable assemblage to a different one rather than a slow continuous exchange of species. This behavior suggests that ecological thresholds are crossed when moisture regimes, water table positions, or disturbance frequencies move beyond the tolerance ranges of particular plant groups, and that once crossed these thresholds result in rapid reorganization of community structure within each habitat type. At the scale of the Euro-American tropics, the cumulative effect of fragmentation and the rise of distinct wetland and dryland floras is the development of a landscape composed of numerous ecological islands separated by climatic and edaphic barriers rather than by large physical distances alone. Refugial coal forests function as humid islands, embedded within a broader matrix of seasonally dry biomes. Their area isolation and internal heterogeneity vary from basin to basin depending on subsidence sedimentation and local climate, but in all cases they provide limited habitat for wetland specialists relative to the earlier period, when perennially humid conditions and broad low relief surfaces allowed swamp vegetation to extend across wide tracts of land. Seed plant-dominated dryland and seasonally wet floras by contrast occupy a much larger share of the tropical lowlands than before, and begin to link up into continuous or semi-continuous belts across parts of Euramerica. The existence of multiple separated refugia has implications for the evolutionary and biogeographic trajectories of plants within the late Carboniferous tropics. Populations of wetland taxa confined to specific basins or paleovalleys experience reduced opportunities for gene flow with populations in other basins, especially when intervening lowlands are occupied by vegetation adapted to more seasonal climates. Over time, this isolation can foster regional differentiation and in some cases lead to local extinctions if climatic or hydrological conditions in a particular refugium deteriorate. At the same time, the expansion of dryland and seasonally wet floras provides new ecological space for seed plants and associated lineages to diversify and to experiment with combinations of traits suited to more variable environments. These processes unfold against a background in which total plant diversity in coal swamps is not especially high by modern tropical standards, but in which the partitioning of species into distinct habitat-linked assemblages produces a complex pattern of spatial turnover and compositional heterogeneity across the equatorial belt. The late Carboniferous world thus enters a phase in which wetland and dryland biomes coexist in close proximity, alternating in dominance through time and across space, and in which the once dominant coal forest biome persists primarily as scattered refugial patches, while new floras structured around more drought-tolerant and seasonally adapted plants occupy the intervening landscapes. In the reorganized late Carboniferous lowlands, arthropods and other small land animals occupy a landscape that no longer consists of one broad, nearly continuous coal forest, but of wetland refugia embedded within more seasonal, and in many places drier terrain, and their responses to this change can be inferred only in outline because the fossil record for these groups is less complete than for plants or for larger vertebrates. In earlier, late Muscovian times, diverse arthropod faunas are associated with the extensive coal swamps of Euramerica. Giant myriapods such as Arthropleura, large griffin flies including Meganeura, and related insect groups, cockroach like Blatopterans, numerous smaller insects, arachnids and crustaceans all make use of the humid vegetated lowlands and the abundant standing and flowing water within them. Many of these animals depend on moist or saturated substrate-sheltered microhabitats or aquatic larval stages, and the broad extent of ever-wet terrain provides continuous or nearly continuous corridors of suitable habitat across much of the equatorial belt. With the onset of stronger climatic seasonality, intensified glacial cycles, and the associated fragmentation of coal forests, this continuity breaks down. Wetland habitats contract into structurally controlled lows, and subsiding basin centres while intervening floodplains, levees, and basin margins develop more strongly seasonal conditions, and new plant communities dominated by seed plants and tree ferns. Arthropod and small vertebrate faunas adjust to this reorganized template in ways that reflect both their ecological tolerances and the patchy nature of preservation. Within the remaining wetland refugia, arthropod assemblages likely retain many of the elements seen in earlier coal forests. Detritivorous myriapods, including large formed where oxygen and resource levels permit still process fallen plant material on peat surfaces and in shallow waterlogged soils. Herbivorous insects feed on frond stems, spores and seeds of tree ferns, seed ferns and residual lycopsids, while predators such as scorpions, spider-like arachnids, and large flying griffin flies continue to exploit dense prey populations in humid, structurally complex forests. Aquatic larvae of insects such as mayflies and related groups, as well as crustaceans and other invertebrates, still occupy ponds, abandoned channels and swamp pools in these basins. Trackways, body fossils and coprolites from late Pennsylvanian coal measures in several basins show that complex arthropod communities persist in wetland settings after the first phase of rainforest fragmentation, although the fine details of species composition and abundance remain difficult to reconstruct. Outside the wettest basins, however, the balance of invertebrate habitats shifts. As floodplains and basin margins experience longer dry intervals and more variable river flows, substrates that were once persistently saturated now undergo repeated drying and rewetting. In these areas, arthropod assemblages increasingly include forms adapted to mineral soils, fluctuating moisture, and more open vegetation. Winged insects capable of dispersal across patches of suitable habitat become particularly important. Early members of groups that favour drier or more variable conditions, such as some orthopteran and hemipteran lineages, appear in greater numbers in deposits interpreted as seasonally stressed lowlands. Ground-dwelling insects and arachnids with life cycles that allow survival in burrows or sheltered microhabitats during dry periods likely expand their ranges. Although direct fossil evidence is limited to footprints, isolated sclerites, and occasional complete specimens preserved in fine-grained floodplain sediments. The change in vegetation structure and continuity also alters the spatial pattern of arthropod distributions. In the earlier, more continuous coal forest phase, many insect and myriapod families achieve wide geographic ranges across the equatorial belt, reflecting broadly similar swamp habitats in many basins. After fragmentation, populations associated with wetland refugia become confined to those basins where suitable conditions persist. An exchange between basins is restricted by the expansion of intervening dryland and seasonally wet biomes. At the same time, invertebrate faunas of the newly expanded dryland and seasonally wet floras develop in parallel on opposite sides of the former coal forest belt, drawing on similar pools of seed plant-associated insects and soil invertebrates, but potentially experiencing limited direct interchange because of geographic and climatic barriers. Statistical studies that compile stratigraphic ranges of many terrestrial and freshwater animal families, including numerous insect families, hint at an extinction pulse among invertebrates in the late Pennsylvanian, associated with drying climates, and the shift from lycopsid-dominated to tree-fern-dominated floras, but the resolution of these data is not yet sufficient to map detailed patterns of regional turnover for specific arthropod groups. The question of how giant arthropods respond to rainforest collapse and associated atmospheric changes illustrates both the insights and the limits of current evidence. For many years, a widely cited explanation holds that the contraction of coal forests and a supposed drop in atmospheric oxygen near the time of the collapse lead directly to the extinction of large insects such as Meganeura and of Arthropleura, on the assumption that these forms depend on hyperoxic air, meaning oxygen concentrations higher than in most later intervals, and on extensive humid forests. Measurements and models of late Paleozoic atmospheric composition do indicate that oxygen levels are high during the late Carboniferous and early Permian, and experimental and theoretical work supports a general link between high oxygen and the ability of insects to attain large body sizes. However, more recent paleontological work shows that both giant griffinflies and Arthropleura persist after the main phase of rainforest collapse and are not restricted to coal forest habitats. Fossils of large Odonatopterans occur in late Carboniferous and Permian deposits that include more open non-swamp vegetation, and Arthropleura is now known from localities outside classic coal swamp settings and into the early Permian in some regions. These records imply that rainforest fragmentation and any associated changes in oxygen concentration are not by themselves sufficient to explain the eventual disappearance of these giant forms. Instead, their extinction likely reflects a combination of factors including longer-term trends in atmospheric oxygen, changes in predator and competitor communities, and the ongoing reorganization of terrestrial ecosystems into new configurations during the later Paleozoic. Even for smaller arthropods, the fossil record across the rainforest collapse points more to a resorting of habitats and faunas than to a single sharp invertebrate extinction boundary. Some families and functional groups tied closely to ever-wet coal forests do decline or disappear regionally as their preferred environments contract, while others associated with seasonally dry or structurally more open vegetation expand. Invertebrate trace fossil assemblages from late Pennsylvanian fluvial and floodplain deposits, including trackways and burrows, record continued activity of diverse terrestrial arthropods on exposed mud surfaces in basins that no longer host extensive mires, indicating that arthropod communities remain robust in many restructured landscapes. Overall richness of terrestrial and freshwater invertebrate families appears to dip during parts of the late Pennsylvanian. in some compilations consistent with environmental stress and habitat loss, but this dip is modest compared with later mass extinctions and is followed by continued evolutionary innovation into the Permian. Within the framework of the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse, therefore, arthropods and other small land animals do not simply vanish with the forests. Rather, they track the shifting mosaic of wetlands, seasonally wet lowlands, and expanding dryland biomes, with some lineages retreating into refugia or declining as their specialized habitats shrink, and others exploiting the new ecological opportunities created by a more heterogeneous and climatically variable late Paleozoic world. In the coal forest phase of the late Muscovian, vertebrate life on land within the equatorial belt is dominated by amphibians and amphibian-grade tetrapods that use the wetlands, rivers and floodplains of Euramerica as their main habitat. These animals occupy a range of body sizes, locomotor styles and ecological roles, yet they share a common dependence on water for reproduction and on moist environments for much of their life cycle. Their bones and trackways occur in the same successions that record coal swamps, anastomosing rivers and floodplain lakes, so their distribution can be reconstructed in a direct environmental context. Large amphibian-grade tetrapods include forms traditionally grouped under labyrinthodonts, many of which resemble crocodile-like predators in general outline. They have broad flat skulls covered with dense bone, large mouths lined with numerous conical teeth, and bodies that may reach lengths of several meters. Their limbs are well developed, but often show features consistent with a predominantly aquatic or semi-aquatic lifestyle, such as sprawling posture and robust girdles that support movement in shallow water and on soft substrates. Some lineages retain lateral line grooves on their skulls, indicating the presence of sensory systems tuned to water movements, and their tail morphology suggests an important role in swimming. These animals inhabit channels, oxbow lakes, and the deeper parts of swamp pools where they feed on fishes and other aquatic vertebrates, as well as on large invertebrates that enter the water. Their skull and tooth structure points to a diet that includes both prey seized at the water surface and animals captured within the water column. Smaller amphibians and amphibian-like tetrapods fill additional roles within the coal forest ecosystems. Lepospondyls and other small body groups reach lengths of only a few tens of centimeters and show a variety of body plans, from elongated limbless or limb-reduced forms suited to burrowing or eel-like swimming to more compact forms with well-developed limbs for walking on land. Some possess long, laterally compressed tails adapted for propulsion in water, while others have body proportions that favour movement through leaf litter and among roots on the forest floor. Their teeth and jaw structures indicate diets focused on insects, other arthropods and small aquatic or semi-aquatic invertebrates. In many basins, these small tetrapods are preserved in association with plant-rich floodplain deposits, siderite concretions formed in waterlogged muds, and fine-grained sediments laid down in quiet water, which together suggest that they use the full range of microhabitats from shallow pools and backwaters to damp forest floors near channel margins. Across the coal forest belt, amphibian life cycles remain tied to water. Eggs lack mineralized shells and must be laid in aquatic environments, or on very moist substrates to prevent desiccation. Larval stages bear gills and live in water, often for extended periods, feeding on small invertebrates and organic particles before metamorphosing into more terrestrial juveniles and adults. Bone histology comparisons with extant amphibians and the association of juvenile remains with aquatic settings support this pattern. Even forms that spend much of adult life on land, such as some dendropetid like taxa, with stronger limbs and more heavily ossified skeletons, still require access to water for reproduction and for larval development. This dependence on permanent or long-lasting water bodies means that the distribution of amphibians closely follows the network of coal swamps, lakes, and rivers in the lowlands. In many equatorial basins, the extent of swamp and floodplain water bodies provides a wide and relatively continuous field of suitable breeding and feeding sites, allowing amphibian populations to occupy large areas of the landscape. Dietary evidence reinforces the close connection between amphibians and aquatic environments. Stomach contents, coprolites, and tooth morphology point to fish and aquatic invertebrates as major food sources for many precasimovian amphibians, especially larger forms that hunt in channels and lakes. Smaller species add insects and other terrestrial arthropods to their diet, especially in forest floor and marginal habitats. But even these often have life cycles that begin in water and involve larval feeding on aquatic resources. In this way, amphibians form an important link between aquatic production in coal forest basins and the terrestrial food webs that extend onto floodplains and into forests, moving energy and nutrients between water and land. The composition of amphibian assemblages in the late Muscovian tropical belt appears relatively cosmopolitan when viewed at the scale of Euramerica. Families and genera of non-amniote tetrapods are recorded from multiple basins spread across the equatorial continent, and many of the same lineages occur in coal measures separated by considerable distances. Diversity compilations that aggregate fossil families through time show a steady increase in both global and within-basin tetrapod diversity from early Carboniferous stages into the Muscovian, with amphibians and amphibian-grade tetrapods making up most of this rise. Extinction rates during this interval remain relatively low, and the fauna as a whole exhibits broad geographic ranges and limited evidence for strong provinciality within the tropical belt. In practical terms, this means that the coal forest world of the late Muscovian supports a vertebrate fauna in which amphibians are widespread, abundant, and taxonomically varied across tropical Pangaea. The distribution and ecology of these animals are shaped by the environmental template already described for the coal forests. In subsiding basins with extensive mires and anastomosing river systems, large aquatic and semi-aquatic species dominate channel and lake margins. Medium-sized forms occupy floodplain ponds, back swamps and swamp interiors, and small-bodied, often more terrestrial species use leaf litter root systems and fallen logs within the forests and on better-drained levees. In more upland or basin margin settings where peat is thinner or absent, but water bodies and wet soils are still common amphibian assemblages, use river margins, oxbows and small lakes embedded in seed plant and tree fern-dominated vegetation. The overall pattern is one of continuous or nearly continuous occupation of humid lowland habitats, with amphibians present wherever permanent or long-lived surface water and moist microhabitats occur. The structure of the amphibian fauna in these settings includes several ecological tiers. At the top of the aquatic or semi-aquatic vertebrate predator guild are large labyrinthodont grade forms that prey on fishes and smaller tetrapods. Beneath them, medium-sized species feed on invertebrates and small vertebrates, acting both as predators and as prey for larger species. At the smallest scales, tiny lepospondyls and other diminutive forms feed primarily on insects and other arthropods, linking the abundant invertebrate productivity of the coal forests to higher trophic levels. Amphibians thus participate in both aquatic and terrestrial food webs, integrating energy flows across the water-land boundary and helping to structure the vertebrate component of coal forest ecosystems. The sedimentary record of some equatorial basins preserves direct evidence of amphibians interacting with the physical environment. Trackways on fine-grained floodplain surfaces document movement patterns of small and medium-sized tetrapods across mud exposed at low water, including parallel sets of footprints that track along channel margins or radiate away from pond edges. Fossil skeletons and articulated partial remains appear in upright tree stumps, abandoned channels, and siderite concretions formed in organic rich muds, showing that individuals sometimes die in hollow trunks, shallow lakes or swamp pools that later fill with sediment and minerals. These occurrences confirm that amphibians use a wide variety of microhabitats within the coal forests, and that their remains are incorporated into the rock record in ways that reflect daily activity patterns and interactions with the swamp terrain. In the context of the late Carboniferous Earth system, the amphibian-dominated tetrapod fauna of the late Moscovian equatorial belt represents a stage in which vertebrate life on land is still strongly constrained by the availability of water and by the spatial pattern of humid lowland habitats. Amniotes are present and already possess traits that reduce their dependence on standing water, but in most tropical basins they remain a minority component of the vertebrate assemblage, while amphibians and amphibian-grade tetrapods form the bulk of the species and individuals recorded. The coal forest biome provides the continuous network of aquatic and moist environments required to sustain this mode of life on a continental scale, and the amphibian fauna in turn forms an integral part of the functioning of those wetlands, connecting aquatic and terrestrial processes and occupying a wide range of trophic and habitat niches within the late Moscovian tropical landscape. In the late Moscovian equatorial belt, the amphibian-dominated tetrapod fauna occupies a broad and relatively continuous range of humid lowland habitats, but as the climatic and vegetational changes described earlier take hold, this same fossil record that documents coal forest fragmentation also records a marked change in tetrapod diversity distribution and ecological structure. Within the uppermost Moscovian and earliest Casimovian strata of several Euro-American basins, family-level diversity curves for non-amniote tetrapods show a rise to a peak, followed by a sharp decline that coincides in time with the main phase of rainforest collapse. In these intervals, extinction rates for families of amphibian-grade tetrapods increase noticeably, while origination rates fall or remain low, producing a net loss of groups that had been widespread across tropical Pangaea. The effect is particularly clear in compilations that aggregate data from multiple basins, which reveal that many long-ranging amphibian families present in pre-collapse coal forest assemblages disappear from the record near or shortly after the transition from lycopsid-dominated swamps to more heterogeneous landscapes of refugial wetlands and seasonally structured floras. At the same time, the overall number of tetrapod families does not remain depressed for long. Instead, it recovers and then surpasses pre-collapse levels within a few million years, with much of this rebound driven by the diversification of amniotes, which begin the interval as a minority component of the fauna and emerge from it as a much more prominent group. The spatial structure of tetrapod faunas changes along with their diversity. Before the collapse, many amphibian and early amniote genera have wide geographic ranges and occur in several tropical basins across Euro-America, reflecting the continuity of coal forest habitats and the availability of similar environmental conditions over large areas. After fragmentation, the distribution of tetrapod taxa becomes more uneven. In some analyses, the surviving faunas of different basins show increased endemism, meaning that particular combinations of species occur in single basins or small regions and are absent elsewhere. This pattern has been interpreted as a result of habitat islands created by rainforest collapse, in which isolated wetland refugia and surrounding seasonally dry lowlands act as terrestrial analogues of archipelagos. In such a view, amphibian lineages that survive the initial habitat loss become restricted to these separate patches, and their subsequent evolution within each refugium leads to distinct regional assemblages. However, more recent work that uses modelling approaches to account for sampling biases suggests that the signal of strong endemism may be overstated, and that when uneven sampling through time and space is taken into account, tetrapod assemblages after the collapse may be at least as cosmopolitan as before. These differing interpretations indicate that for the late Carboniferous record, there is broad agreement on a significant extinction and reorganization of tetrapod faunas accompanying rainforest collapse, while the precise degree to which this event increases regional distinctiveness versus maintaining or even enhancing broad-scale similarity remains under active study. The ecological pattern is clearer. Families and genera of amphibian-grade tetrapods that are strongly tied to ever-wet coal forest environments decline as these habitats contract. Many large aquatic or semi-aquatic forms that depend on extensive networks of swamps and floodplains show reduced ranges or disappear from several basins as mires shrink into refugia and rivers adopt more variable flow regimes. In their place, smaller and more ecologically flexible lineages, including some lepospondylls that can exploit both aquatic and terrestrial microhabitats, persist in wetlands and along rivers that continue to provide permanent or long-lived water bodies. At the same time, amniotes which had been present but relatively rare in pre-collapse faunas begin to diversify into a wider array of habitats. Their eggs enclosed in protective membranes and often additional coverings can develop away from open water, and their skin reduces water loss compared with that of most amphibians. These traits allow amniotes to use seasonally dry floodplains, basin margins and upland slopes more effectively than most non-amniote tetrapods. In many late Pennsylvanian and earliest Permian assemblages, early synapsids and sauropsids appear in deposits interpreted as more open, better drained lowlands and uplands, with seasonally structured climates, while amphibians remain most abundant in wetland and riparian settings. The timing of this ecological shift varies between regions, but overall the trend through the late Carboniferous and earliest Permian is for amniotes to take on a greater share of tetrapod diversity in environments that experience stronger seasonality and more frequent or prolonged drying. In addition to differences in habitat use, the trophic structure of tetrapod communities also changes. Before the collapse, large amphibian predators dominate many aquatic vertebrate food webs in tropical basins, with fishes and smaller tetrapods forming their prey. After fragmentation as coal forest retreat, and rivers and lakes in some basins become more seasonal or more isolated, amniote lineages with more terrestrial feeding strategies appear more frequently in the record. Early synapsids include taxa with dentitions suited to insectivory and small vertebrate carnivory, and later in the interval herbivorous forms begin to appear, indicating that tetrapods are starting to exploit plant-based food resources more extensively on land. Although these changes continue into later stages and are not confined to the immediate aftermath of the collapse, their roots lie in the interval when wetland habitats shrink and seasonally structured vegetation expands. The net result is that across the late Muscovian to earliest Permian interval, the tetrapod fauna of the equatorial belt passes from a state in which amphibians and amphibian-grade tetrapods dominate both diversity and biomass in many lowland settings, to one in which non-amniote tetrapods are more restricted to wet refugia and riparian corridors, while amniotes occupy an increasing range of seasonally dry and upland habitats, and contribute a growing share of overall diversity. At the same time, the total number of tetrapod lineages continues to increase on long timescales, even though this growth is punctuated by the extinction pulse associated with rainforest collapse, and by ongoing losses among amphibian lineages less able to adjust to the climatic and environmental regimes that characterize the late Carboniferous and earliest Permian terrestrial world. In the latest Moscovian and earliest Casimovian landscapes of Euramerica, early amniotes occupy a world in which coal forests have been reduced to refugial patches, and broad areas of the lowlands are now covered by seasonally dry or intermittently wet vegetation. The climatic and vegetational patterns described earlier with wetland mires confine to structural lows and seed plant-dominated floras spreading across levees, floodplains and basin margins create environmental gradients that align closely with the physiological differences between amniotes and amphibians. Amniotes are tetrapods whose eggs contain membranes that enclose the embryo in a fluid-filled microenvironment and help conserve water, and whose skins are covered by keratinized tissues such as scales, or scale-like structures that reduce cutaneous water loss. Their lungs are ventilated primarily by movements of a well-developed rib cage, rather than relying heavily on gas exchange through moist skin. These features do not free early amniotes from all dependence on moisture, but they allow reproduction and much of the life cycle to take place away from open water and permit persistent activity on substrates that experience regular drying. In the coal forest phase, amniotes already exist alongside amphibians in some basins, but their fossils are relatively rare and often associated with particular microhabitats. Classic examples include Hylonomus and other small amniotes preserved into hollow tree stumps within coastal swamp successions, where they appear to use standing trees and fallen logs as shelter and hunting grounds on slightly raised, better-drained sites within the broader coal forest. Similar finds in other sequences show small lizard-sized animals with narrow skulls, sharp conical teeth, and lightly built skeletons adapted for agile movement on land and in cluttered forest floors. These early amniotes are primarily insectivores and small carnivores feeding on arthropods, and small vertebrates, and their size and body plans suit them to exploiting crevices, burrows and leaf litter, as well as the surfaces of logs and low branches. As the climate becomes more seasonal and coal forests retreat into refugia, the range of environments suitable for such animals expands. Seasonally dry floodplains and basin margins with seed plant and tree fern dominated vegetation provide extensive tracts of ground, where mineral soils develop leaf litter, accumulates on surfaces that dry between rainy seasons, and invertebrate prey remains abundant. Amphibians can still occupy these areas during wet intervals, but their need for open water for reproduction and their susceptibility to desiccation constrain their ability to maintain populations through extended dry phases. Amniotes, by contrast, can use burrows, crevices in soil and rock, and the interior of logs to avoid extremes of temperature and humidity, and their eggs can develop in nest sites hidden within litter or shallow soil without direct contact with surface water. The fossil record supports this ecological partitioning at least in broad outline. In late Pennsylvanian and earliest Permian strata, interpreted as seasonally dry or intermittently wet lowlands, early synapsids and sauropsids occur in association with paleosols that show repeated wetting and drying, and with plant assemblages dominated by seed ferns, chordates and early conifer-like plants. Their skeletal anatomy, including more robust vertebral columns, stronger limb girdles and limb joints that support more sustained terrestrial locomotion, is consistent with life on firmer, better-drained substrates. Tooth morphology points to diets that focus on arthropods and small vertebrates, and in some lineages incipient specialization toward particular prey types can be inferred from tooth shape and wear, although detailed reconstructions are limited by sample size. Within basins that still contain wetland refugia amniotes also occur, but they tend to be more common in deposits representing levees, crevasse splays, and higher parts of the floodplain than in the deepest mire interiors. This distribution suggests that amniotes track the drier and more variable parts of the lowland mosaic, while amphibians remain concentrated in areas with permanent or long-lived water bodies. The reorganization of vegetation into wetland and dryland floras is mirrored by a reorganization of tetrapod habitat use, in which early amniotes become the principal vertebrates of the seasonally dry domain, on geomorphically higher ground where soils may crack during dry spells and then soften. During rains, amniotes can forage for insects on, and within the soil move between patches of vegetation and retreat into shelters when conditions become unfavourable. On levees and terraces adjacent to rivers, they can exploit both terrestrial and aquatic food webs by hunting invertebrates that congregate along the water margin and small vertebrates that use these ecotones. In basins where fire becomes more common on seasonally dry surfaces, the ability to move relatively rapidly across ground and to retreat into burrows or rock crevices may offer additional advantages, although direct fossil evidence for fire-related behaviour is lacking. Over longer timescales, the same traits that allow early amniotes to persist in drying landscapes also position them to occupy a growing range of habitats as climates continue to favour seasonally structured and in many regions increasingly arid conditions. Diversity analyses through the late Carboniferous and earliest Permian show that after an initial extinction, pulse associated with rainforest collapse, amniote family diversity rises and eventually surpasses pre-collapse levels, with much of this growth occurring in environments that no longer support extensive wetland forests, but instead host woodlands and shrublands dominated by seed plants. Within this context, early amniotes in the equatorial belt occupy and diversify within the parts of the landscape that become typical of the more open, seasonally dry terrestrial ecosystems of the early Permian, especially on floodplains, basin margins, and low uplands that experience repeated drying. Their fossil occurrences in drying lowlands, together with their anatomical adaptations for water conservation and terrestrial locomotion, provide one of the main lines of evidence for how vertebrate life responds to the climatic and environmental changes that restructure habitats during and after the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse, even though many details of their behaviour physiology and precise habitat preferences remain inferred rather than directly preserved in the rock record. In the late stages of the Carboniferous, after coal forests have fragmented and lycopsid-dominated, mires have retreated into refugia, the equatorial regions of Euramerica contain a wider range of biome types than in earlier parts of the period. Instead of a single, nearly continuous belt of ever-wet swamp forest, the lowlands now include seasonally dry woodlands and shrublands, mixed wetland-dryland mosaics on floodplains, and more open vegetation on basin margins, and low uplands alongside the remaining patches of tree fern-dominated peatlands. Evidence for these new biomes comes from plant macrofossils, dispersed spores, and pollen paleosols, and the character of associated sedimentary rocks. And together these records show that tropical climate regimes have reorganized in ways that allow drought-tolerant vegetation to occupy large parts of the landscape that once lie within the coal forest domain. One of the main new biome types is the seasonally dry lowland flora that develops on mineral soils subject to repeated wetting and drying. These plant communities occur on levees, interfluves, alluvial fans and basin margins, where the water table lies well below the surface for much of the year and only rises toward the topsoil during rainy seasons. Paleosols from these settings display structures that indicate alternating expansion and contraction of clays, accumulations of carbonate nodules and other minerals that form when evapotranspiration exceeds precipitation, and horizons with root traces of plants that tolerate periods of soil moisture deficit. Within these soils, fossil floras are dominated by seed plants, especially pteridosperms and chordates, with contributions from early conifer-like gymnosperms and from Maratialian tree ferns that can withstand intervals of reduced water availability. Leaves are often narrow or dissected. Cuticles are relatively thick, and stomatal patterns suggest adaptations that reduce water loss compared with the broad, thin leaves of many coal swamp species. The overall composition and leaf physiognomy point to climates with strong seasonality and rainfall, where plants must endure extended dry spells between wet periods rather than continuous saturation. The structure of these seasonally dry floras differs from that of coal forests as well. Instead of dense stands of tall lycopsid trunks rooted in peat, the vegetation forms open to moderately closed woodlands and shrublands on mineral substrates. Tree crowns may be separated by gaps of herbaceous or low shrubby cover, and root systems penetrate deeper into the soil to reach stored moisture. Litter layers accumulate on surfaces that can dry, and organic matter is incorporated into mineral horizons rather than forming thick peat. Fire becomes a more frequent disturbance in some of these environments, as dry seasons produce combustible litter and twigs, and elevated atmospheric oxygen continues to favor ignition when lightning strikes. Charcoal fragments in some late Carboniferous dryland deposits, together with inertinite in thin coals and organic-rich mudstones, show that fires pass through these landscapes, periodically removing surface vegetation and influencing patterns of plant regeneration. The combination of woody seed-producing plants, seasonally dry soils, and recurring fire regimes marks these lowland woodlands and shrublands as biomes, distinct from the ever-wet coal swamps that precede them. Between the driest basin margins and the wettest refugial mires, mixed wetland-dryland mosaics develop on floodplains that still receive regular flooding, but also experience intervals of exposure and soil development. In these settings, channels migrate across the valley floor, building natural levees, crevasse splays, and small overbank lobes of sand and silt. Low-lying areas near persistent water bodies may support peat or organic rich muds with tree ferns and other wetland plants, while slightly higher ground hosts seed plant-dominated vegetation on mineral soils. Within a single sedimentary cycle, coal or carbonaceous shale may be overlain by rooted mudstone with seed fern and chordate roots, then by channel sandstone, reflecting a progression from mire to seasonally wet woodland to active river channel as water tables fall and rise, and as the locus of deposition shifts. Plant assemblages from these mixed settings contain elements of both wetland and dryland floras, but typically consist of discrete patches in which one or the other group dominates rather than a single, continuously varying community. The resulting biome is not a uniform intermediate between swamp and dry land, but a spatially complex mosaic in which small wet areas track the positions of channels, oxbows and depressions, and drier ground supports woodlands and shrublands that expand and contract as climate and river dynamics change. As climates trend toward greater seasonality, and in some regions overall drying, more open vegetation also spreads onto low uplands and distal basin margins. In these areas, sedimentary records show red beds with oxidized iron minerals, calcareous paleosols, and in some cases Aeolian sandstones, all of which indicate better drained conditions and locally semi-arid climates. Fossil floras in such deposits are often sparse but consistently dominated by drought-tolerant seed plants, with relatively few wetland taxa. Roots penetrate deeply into paleosols, suggesting that plants tap moisture stored well below the surface, and the spacing of stems inferred from root patterns implies woodlands with significant gaps between trees. In combination with seasonally dry lowland floras, these upland and basin margin communities represent an expansion of dry adapted biomes that occupy terrain far beyond the confines of the remaining coal forest refugia. The emergence and spread of these new biomes change how the late Carboniferous land surface interacts with the atmosphere and with the sedimentary basins that record its history. In ever-wet coal swamps, evapotranspiration is high and relatively steady through the year. Canopy cover is dense and peat accumulation locks away a significant fraction of net primary production as buried organic carbon. In seasonally dry woodlands and shrublands, evapotranspiration is more strongly pulsed with high fluxes during wet seasons and reduced fluxes during dry seasons, and much of the organic matter produced each year is returned rapidly to the atmosphere through decomposition and fire rather than being stored as peat. On low uplands and in semi-arid basin margins, sparse vegetation allows greater temperature fluctuations at the surface and enhances physical weathering and soil erosion during storms. These differences in surface processes feed back into the sedimentary systems that operate in late Carboniferous basins. River systems draining seasonally dry and upland biomes transport larger volumes of clastic sediment during high-flow events, contributing to thicker packages of sandstones and mudstones between individual coal seams. Floodplain soils develop stronger structures and more mature profiles where vegetation stabilizes surfaces over extended intervals between major floods, while in channel belts and on some interfluves erosion cuts into older deposits and redistributes sediment down valley. The net effect is a transition in many basins from successions dominated by closely spaced laterally extensive coals and associated organic rich strata to successions in which thinner, more discontinuous coals alternate with thicker clastic intervals that record repeated phases of soil formation, channel migration, and floodplain reworking under more variable climatic regimes. From a biogeographical perspective, the coexistence of refugial coal forests, seasonally dry lowland woodlands, mixed floodplain mosaics, and more open upland vegetation in the late Carboniferous tropics creates a patchwork of biomes that differ in climate substrate and ecological structure. Wetland floras remain phylogenetically diverse but spatially restricted, confined to the wettest parts of basins, while seasonally dry floras dominated by seed plants occupy a much larger share of the tropical lowlands and expand across basin margins and low uplands. Animal communities track this pattern with amphibian-rich assemblages persisting in wetland refugia and along perennial rivers, and amniote-rich assemblages becoming characteristic of seasonally dry floodplains and uplands. The late Carboniferous landscape is therefore defined not by a single dominant biome, but by a set of interacting biomes whose distribution is controlled by climate topography and hydrology, and whose combined activity reshapes the ways in which carbon, water, and sediment move through the tropical Earth system during the final stages of the period. By the earliest Permian, the legacy of the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse is expressed not as a single dramatic boundary, but as a set of reorganized patterns in climate, vegetation, animal life, and sedimentary processes across the equatorial regions of Pangaea. The late Paleozoic Ice Age continues, but some records indicate that ice sheets on Gondwana begin to follow a trajectory toward eventual waning, with glacial episodes separated by longer, less icy intervals, and with signs that carbon dioxide levels are no longer at their absolute minimum. Within this climatic framework, the low-latitude belts that once host extensive, nearly continuous coal forests now support a mosaic of biomes in which seasonally dry vegetation, refugial wetlands, and more open upland communities coexist and interact. In many Euramerican basins, earliest Permian strata show that thick, laterally extensive coal seams are less common than in earlier Pennsylvanian parts of the succession. Where coal does occur, it is often confined to relatively thin, laterally restricted beds that represent mires in structurally controlled lows, or in valleys where groundwater remains close to the surface. Surrounding these remnant peatlands, thicker packages of sandstones and mudstones with well-developed paleosols channel bodies, and floodplain deposits record the activity of river systems that drain landscapes covered by seed plant-dominated vegetation on mineral soils. Floras from these successions confirm that seed plants now play the leading role in many lowland and upland settings. Pteridosperms, chordaites, and early conifer-like gymnosperms are common in macrofossil assemblages, and dispersed cuticles, while Maratielian tree ferns remain important in wetlands and along watercourses, but no longer define a single basin-spanning swamp biome. Spore and pollen records show that assemblages from wetland habitats and from seasonally dry lowlands continue to form distinct groups, each with its own characteristic composition. Yet the area occupied by dryland and seasonally wet floras exceeds that of persistent peat-forming wetlands in many basins. This distribution reflects a continuation and consolidation of the trends that begin during the late Moscovian and earliest Casimovian. The shift from spore plant-dominated coal forests to a seed plant-dominated world proceeds, and by earliest Permian time the new equilibrium in many tropical basins consists of scattered wetland wet spots embedded within extensive dryland and mixed floodplain biomes. On the animal side, tetrapod assemblages in earliest Permian deposits preserve the outcome of the extinction and diversification patterns set in motion during the rainforest collapse. Non-amniote tetrapods, especially amphibian grade forms, remain most abundant in sediments laid down in and near wetlands, lakes and perennial rivers, where permanent or long-lived water bodies provide the conditions needed for their reproduction and for larval development. However, their family-level diversity is reduced compared with peak late Moscovian values, and many earlier lineages are absent from earliest Permian records in the tropics. Amniotes, by contrast, are better represented in earliest Permian faunas than in pre-collapse assemblages. Early synapsids and sauropsids occur in fluvial and floodplain deposits associated with seasonally dry lowlands, with some taxa showing specializations for more fully terrestrial locomotion and for feeding on a wider range of prey, including insects, small vertebrates, and in some later forms plant material. Their presence in these settings indicates that the ecological shift toward amniote-dominated faunas in seasonally structured climates, first detected in late Pennsylvanian successions, continues and strengthens into earliest Permian time. The net result is a tetrapod fauna in which amphibians are still significant, but are more tightly constrained to wet habitats, while amniotes occupy a growing variety of roles in drier lowlands and uplands. Sedimentary and geomorphic records in earliest Permian basins further illustrate the ongoing legacy of rainforest collapse. In many regions, river styles and floodplain architectures differ from those characteristic of earlier coal forest successions. Meandering and braided single-threaded channels, more extensive overbank sand bodies, and thicker, more mature paleosols are common, while the laterally stable multi-channel anastomosing rivers strongly tied to densely forested floodplains become less prominent. These changes reflect the combined influence of altered vegetation, cover increased seasonality in discharge, and possibly more frequent fire in seasonally dry landscapes. Charcoal and inertinite remain present in coals and organic rich mudstones, indicating that wildfires continue to operate as disturbances in both wetland margins and dryland biomes, redistributing nutrients and affecting vegetation structure. In terms of the long-term carbon cycle, earliest Permian conditions represent a stage in which the intense organic carbon burial of peak coal forest times has already declined, but has not yet given way to the fully non-glacial climates of later Permian intervals. Coal formation still contributes to carbon sequestration, but the reduced areal extent and continuity of peatlands mean that less carbon is stored in tropical lowland mires than during earlier phases of the late Paleozoic Ice Age. At the same time, increased weathering of mineral soils in seasonally dry and upland regions, together with changes in fire regimes, influences how carbon and nutrients move between land atmosphere and ocean. Reviews of late Carboniferous and earliest Permian plant communities across multiple basins emphasize that these ecosystems are not static. Instead, they respond to glacial-interglacial oscillations superimposed on a longer trend toward warmer and more arid conditions. During more humid phases, wetlands and coal-forming mires can expand locally, while in drier phases they retreat into refugia, and seed plant-dominated dryland floras occupy more of the landscape. Over time, the balance shifts toward the latter, so that earliest Permian biomes can be viewed as part of a transitional suite of ecosystems that bridge the interval between the peak coal forest world and the seasonally dry, predominantly seed plant-dominated landscapes of the later Permian. The legacy of the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse in these earliest Permian settings is therefore expressed not as an isolated episode, but as a continuing pattern of reduced wetland extent, increased dominance of drought, tolerant vegetation, altered river and fire regimes, and a tetrapod fauna in which amniotes equipped for life away from permanent water take on an increasingly central role in the reorganized tropical terrestrial ecosystems of Pangaea.